Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut, and Uranio Pais is not here today. And today I am interviewing my dear friend and colleague of ours, Elizabeth Cotton. We warmly call her Lizzy. And she's here to talk about being a social four and what that experience is like. This is part of our series on talking about types and subtypes. And we've done the self-preservation four podcast, and we've done a sexual four podcast. And now we're completing the subtype series on fours by talking with someone who has a lot of experience of observing herself and working with the Enneagram. So I think we have a lot to learn from her today. So welcome, Lizzy.
Thank you. Really glad to be here.
Very happy to have you on the podcast.
Yeah.
So first, I like to start with, how you maybe came to know the Enneagram and a little bit about yourself. How long have you known about it? How did you encounter it? And, what do you do in life?
Yeah. So I'm a psychotherapist, and the first time I encountered the Enneagram was actually in graduate school because one of my classmates was doing a project on it. So that was the first I heard about it, and I thought it was interesting, but it didn't land as deeply. There were other things that I was studying. And then not too long of a time after, I was in couples therapy, and our therapist was interested in the Enneagram, and she had a, sort of more than a sneaking suspicion of who I was because I was so focused on relationship and kind of outsized needs for relatedness and connection. And so she had us do the test and some exploration, and sure enough, as she suspected, I was a four, and all kinds of bells went off because I'd been a seeker kind of all my life, and I'd studied astrology and different typing processes and tools because I wanted to increase my own self-awareness in service of decreasing my suffering, which was always looming large. Yeah, then I was continued to be really fascinated with the Enneagram, and then have been more and more involved with it and seeing what an incredible map it is to understand personality, and also a vehicle to shed personality and actually reside more in your deeper nature.
Right.
So,
Yes, beautiful. And the way I originally know you is that we're both psychotherapists. So can you say a little bit about how you've maybe seen the Enneagram as a tool that you actually use with clients?
yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I've been a psychotherapist for over 30 years, and I'd say in the last 10 or 15, and been using the Enneagram a lot as a helpful tool with clients that are also intrigued and interested and turned on by that. I especially like it using it with couples because, and I see it over and over again, once someone understands their type and they understand their other person's type, they no longer personalize every single thing. So, for example, like as a four, I'm very susceptible to perceiving everything as abandonment. But once I know that, oh, one of my partners earlier was a nine, it's like, oh, they just need space. And um, they're actually not abandoning me, they're not rejecting me, they're actually taking care of themselves. So that kind of understanding it without personalizing is huge. Yeah, just sidebar, and I'll come back to that
Okay.
because you know I've been on the path for a long time, right? And I know a lot, and there's so much that I've risen above that I'm not at, just under the difficulties and stress. But being a social four, I'm telling you, it's like as soon as you ask me to do it, and I'm thinking, yeah, this will be good. It's just shame. So as much of the work that I've done, and it's a lot, it's quite like impressive in a certain way to see how deeply ingrained that is, and to some degree, consciously and unconsciously, always working with that or working against it and things like that. So you're asking me questions, and sometimes there's a pause because it's like first I have to sort of wade through all the, you know, feelings and things that are coming up still. Having done
Yeah.
this for a long time, I have much more control over that, and I can choose where to place my attention, but that doesn't mean that it still doesn't sort of arise. And yeah.
I totally get you. And I hope we can include this in the podcast because I think it's perfect, because one of the things I was thinking about is I was thinking, well, I want to talk about how the social four is really the four of the three subtypes that is more focused on shame and sadness, and it can have kind of, a tendency toward depression. And I even noticed asking you, when I thought about asking you that, I'm like, oh, okay, trigger the shame, But the
Right.
beauty of it is, I mean, I think the beauty of the work that you've done, and why I'm excited to have you on this podcast, is because even though I know you as someone who's really, really doing the work, both psychological and spiritual, and you have for a long time, and I've seen you change and shift, you're also still really, really familiar with the hardest stuff that people go through who are social fours. And so I think I really think I like interviewing people who are both still wrestling with the hardest stuff of their type and subtype, and have also been working with it long enough that can tell us what to try, or what works and what doesn't work, or what's worked and what gets hard, even though there are things that have worked. So maybe just, tell us a little more about that, about, what is the focus of attention for the social four, and how do you kind of stay stuck in shame even while you try to work against it?
Yeah, there's a constant um there's a constant hum, and sometimes it's like a loud and sometimes it's more subdued, but of, am I going to be okay? Am I going to do a good enough job? Am I going to be exposed? Am I going to be accepted, rejected? Um yeah, am I good enough? Am I sufficient? And there's this deep-seated allegiance in a way to a sense of deficiency. And so even when there's a place of like, actually, I'm not feeling deficient and I'm good, there's still this like suspicion of that. Even it's really staggering, really, when you start seeing it in its full, you know, blossomed
Right.
ever. I mean, yeah, and so um, and in this kind of a setting, so a one-on-one conversation for me, it's not going to come up. But I'm aware that this will be viewed, right? And
Right.
so then there's this immediate sense of exposure, and then
Yeah.
with potential exposure, and also, yeah, well, anyway, there's just the fear of humiliation, attack, rejection, abandonment, and it's so far from the truth of my experience, actually. I mean, maybe when I was little, and maybe who knows from, whenever, but uh, it gives me a lot of compassion, not only for myself, but just for the human condition, because it's like, this is how we are, right? We have this
Yeah.
fixation and this sense and this belief that's not based on anything true, and that doesn't hold water now, but it has so much hold over our experience and our sense of self.
Right.
Um,
It's like our egos are relentless, even when, maybe what we might call our higher self or truer self or essential self, even when we built that up and there's a big part of us that knows what's more true and that we're okay. The ego is really strong, and always, like you're saying, even when I'm doing well, that's right on the edge there, injecting suspicion or questioning. And one of the things you're reminding me of is how much each of the types and subtypes are almost a facet of the human condition that we all share. Because I'm sure a lot of people listening to this who aren't social fours have experienced shame or, questioning themselves or feeling inadequate or, fearing abandonment or rejection or being seen and disapproved of. I mean, I think that's such a common experience. And yet I think the social four swims in that the most. It's like it's hardest to get out of that pool
Yeah.
of a kind of suffering, of like always this kind of undercurrent of, not being good enough or being judged wanting or something along those lines.
Yeah.
So I can feel that in myself as well. Although I think with being a two and the passion of pride, what I'm thinking as you're talking is like, wow, I really relate to that. I think one difference is I feel like I can take more vacations from that state of mind. I think that's part of what pride does. I sometimes say that pride is anti-shame
Yeah.
because it's a little bit like you get to go into an illusion for a while that
Right.
everything's fine and you look great and you're not aging and everything,
Right.
and yet every once in a while, you look in a mirror and it's like, oh no, like I was totally kidding myself.
Yeah.
Whereas I think for the social four, they don't retreat into a prideful illusion as much. They don't get that vacation.
Right. No, and it's often the opposite, right? Because,
Right.
we live in this place of self-diminishment. And so then it's always these happy surprises of like, no, you look great, or this is wonderful, or, and I have so many things that I do that are great and wonderful and I'm skilled at and things like that.
Yeah.
But as we know, from working together and knowing each other for many years, yeah, that is still a work in progress of just being really standing behind my gifts and talents, and from a place of just owning it, not an ego, not a pride. It's just like, oh yeah, this is, I do this and I do it well, and um, yeah, and I have fun doing it. So there.
Exactly, exactly. And I think, there's so many good things happening in your life and that I know to be true of you. As a social four, what do you think is hard about kind of holding on to the good stuff? Because I know fours generally, and especially the social four, sometimes there's this sort of strange thing about how um, the shadow for social four is actually the good stuff.
Yeah.
Right? For all
Yeah.
the rest of us, shadow usually has some component of anger or shame or hatred or sadness or depressive episodes. But for fours, the shadow is actually all the good things that you're not owning fully in your life experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And
tell
a
us
lot.
more about that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, so let's just first say it's just habit, right? It's a very ingrained
Right.
habit um, of really noticing what's not working, what's not there, what's wrong. And underneath it, for me, there's kind of a sense of how it could be. And like even now, I'm in my garden, and rather than feeling like, wow, this is amazing, and look at these beautiful flowers, what I notice is, oh, that stone should be moved over there, and not even the work, but like, it's not where it could be, it's not where it should be, and so then there's like a feeling of angst and you know, I mean, somewhat could be melancholy coming in there as well, but it's this kind of it's a sense of that it could be, for me, actually, it could be more beautiful. It's like there's a way
Mhm.
that there's a potential for this perfect beauty here, whether it's relational or it's a movie that I'm seeing, or I'm in the garden, or I'm in the view. Sometimes we're driving around here, and so I live in West Marin, right, which is like incredibly beautiful. As soon as the like grass starts to dry, I'm like fixated on it. So it's like, there'll just be one kind of patch of brown. I'm just like, oh, wow, it's like it's over. And my husband will just say, okay, like, but over here, like the hills are so
If you turn your chair over this way, it's absolutely beautiful.
right, and it's like, "Thank you, yes," because it's the habit, right? Of like, "That's right," and it just pops in there, and but there is kind of like this poetic, melancholy longing for how it could be and should be, and, so that may factor in there a little bit, and, in that, there's a habit and a comfort in feeling, kind of down in pain, suffering, and it's not as new and threatening and insecure, you know? There's like
Right.
feeling of if I'm I mean, and I'm talking more obviously from the ego standpoint, because when I'm
Right.
just rested in myself, of course, everything is just as it is and it's quite beautiful and satisfying and fulfilling and things like that. But we're
Hmm.
talking about kind of how the ego gets caught.
Right.
And yeah, and in those moments, it's almost like I'm on not on solid ground. I'm disconnected from myself. So where can I find ground that for me feels solid? Oh, in this identity that's suffering and having a hard time and, you know, and if only this was better. And then sometimes, I can really milk it and feel like, oh, like this soupy, kind of sappy sadness that's like, sad music and yeah, and I feel very comfortable and it's like, oh, that's like the putting on the big puffy, you know, comforter and yeah, when so it's it's really pretty fascinating, really, the whole thing. But
It actually is because, as you may know, I tend to be kind of protective of fours because ever since I first started my Enneagram studies, sometimes it seems like people project negative stuff onto fours because, like, okay, they don't want to feel their sadness, so they're going to project something negative onto people who are more in touch with sadness, And so I'm aware of that. That said, I think there is something adaptive and defensive, like it's a defensive strategy just like all the other 9 types have and 27 subtypes have. It's just one that I think people that don't have it don't understand as much, like to have a coping strategy that's kind of about that gets something out of being attached to suffering,
yeah,
um, that is adaptive and habitual and familiar, and you get something out of that. I think some people of other types look at fours, and again, especially I think social four, that is more in touch typically with sadness and shame and sort of lives more in that there are people who kind of look at fours and say, well, I don't really get it. How can this be a defensive strategy? It looks like a hard thing, like a challenge to be always looking on the dark side or always looking at what's missing or being attached in a certain, getting something out of suffering or having a hard time letting go of suffering
right.
so that I can get somewhere else. So, can you help us understand in your experience? And I think you're particularly good at this of how can non fours understand the coping mechanism, the adaptive strategy at the heart of social four that does get something about being really in touch with feelings and even that kind of sense of inferiority sometimes social fours can dwell on.
Because it feels like it happens so, like, why does it happen? Like, what makes a four? Because it's like, okay, so there's some insecurity, so instead of feeling insecure, I prefer to feel securely bad, and
Right.
but
I think what you just said was brilliant,
mm,
which is instead of a certain kind of insecurity, there's a leaning into a familiar insecurity that's different in a way that makes it more comfortable,
yeah,
you
yeah.
know?
When you've been told, things about yourself that are subpar, and that you believe them, and so yeah, as a little person, um,
Right. So, what have you been doing kind of to work on your ego that you think has worked the most? Because I know you've done a lot of spiritual work in a spiritual community, and you've been a psychotherapist and done a lot of your own psychological work. What would you say has helped you the most?
I would say doing both a psychospiritual path. So that includes the psychological piece of the descending journey of being able to see and understand your defensive structure. And that's the Enneagram has been incredibly helpful for that. And
Mhm.
simultaneously, through a more ascending journey of being able to experience your essential self, your kind of true nature,
I want to remind you of something you said that I thought was very humorous in a panel I did once, a panel of fours. And I'd love to hear what you think about it. So I remember you were on the panel, and when I asked you what was most challenging about being in relationship for you, you thought about it for a minute, and then you said, realizing there's another person there,
Right.
which I thought was great.
Right? And so I know, and it's so interesting because here we are doing this, podcast here, and the internal experience as a four, right, as me, as self-referencing like that, is so loud, and so I'm so aware of all of my feelings that are going on, and that's making me feel tongue-tied, and and then it's like, oh my God, I have such a desire to appear, like I know what I'm talking about, and I'm short-circuited by this emotional experience,
Right,
and 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 I can laugh about it and cry about it at the same time because it's just true, and
right,
yeah, and your prior question, um, what I've benefited from, and also what I offer as psychotherapist to clients is the combination of a psychospiritual path, right? And so
right,
that um, the psychological piece again, seeing so that we can relax and dissolve some of the defensive structure. Enneagram really helping with that, being able to really identify who are we when we're not connected to ourselves, and
right,
also the ascending journey through meditation and spiritual practice and spiritual learnings and readings and teachings, being able to have a more often continuous experience of my true nature, right? Unencumbered by my defensive structure, so that then I
right,
can rest and relax, know, oh, this is who I really am. And that's who I take myself to be when I'm not this. And so it's such an interesting experience doing this with you now because of my propensity toward shame and insecurity in that way. I
right.
can feel both right now, so I could just drop
Yes,
into my true nature and relax. But my poor little social for, self is having a little field day. And also as a social, you know, I was motivated to say yes when you asked me because, like, for the benefit of all beings, right? So even
yes.
though me, personal self, kind of doesn't want to be doing this, because
Right, right,
um, the social part, which tends, social instinct, my dominant instinct,
right,
um, basically runs my life. So
right.
yeah, and yeah, so the work that I do with people, the work that I do with myself, is a combination of understanding all of that. And the Enneagram, I mean, especially in the acceleration of my own deconstruction, frankly, and, awakening, has been so impacted by, the Enneagram, and with you and Ranio
Mhm.
really helping, you
So
know.
I love how you put that the defensive structure that is our ego patterns that are always going and trying to, assert dominance are things that we can watch and learn and see in action. And the spiritual part really helps us, like you said, kind of be able to hold everything in a larger space and drop into something that's deeper and truer for us. And so I really like how real time you're helping us understand even the challenge of the moment in doing a podcast is, can I be enough in who I really am and kind of keep behind the door or keep sort of fending off this ego, this social four ego part of me that always wants to come in and tell me I'm less and see all the things that are wrong and focus on all the negatives, which make it hard to really be in, to be resting in who I know I really am, and more, which I think is beautiful. I wonder if it would be interesting for people to focus a little bit more on the high side, which we can also, it's always a little bit dangerous with the ego, right? We want to talk about the strengths of any given type or subtype. we can, but the ego is always the ego.
Right.
But that said, I wonder how it is for you and how you do focus on the good parts of who you are, of your real self, because I know you do that and you've talked about that even here. How do you almost shift the center of gravity? How do you what can you own? What kinds of things can you do as a social for to not get dragged down so much from that voice that's always telling you or you're not enough or reminding you you're on a podcast and there's an audience in light of that. There is this desire to be of service and to help and to share what's positive in your experience too.
Yeah, it's tricky in a sense because while we have to change our behavior, we don't like being told what to do. And often if someone comes in with like, oh, just look on the bright side, or you could do this, like there's truth to it, but basically we will feel unmet and misunderstood and just like, kind of blow you off. And
Right.
so there's this way, and I can feel it happening right now as you were talking, like something's dropping in me and my emotions are opening. And so I could get a little teary. And it doesn't
Mhm.
feel like sadness. It just feels like,
Mhm.
oh, wait, something's melting open. And I'm like kind of
Mhm.
dropping more into the truth of who I am. And then what becomes available is so it's not like, okay, what do I need to do to be happy or look at things from a different perspective? I'm just
Right.
more rested. And then what becomes available is my genuine uh, warmth and empathy and love and service and my capacity to really like attune and meet someone exactly where
Mhm.
they are with a tremendous amount of space and non-judgmentalness. And having been through like the pits of despair and hell and horror, if I'm not there and caught there, which not so much anymore, but ever anyway, but I have so much capacity to hang out with other people there without judgment,
Mhm.
and also try to be able to finesse with a type 4, with a great degree of empathy and understanding and like how hard this kind of juggernaut is. But
Right.
there is a different way. We have to take some steps to do that, otherwise it's just, yeah, this regressed part of the self kind of having a tantrum, and who wants that really, and
Right.
yeah, so uh, and then there's something that's always surprising still because my identity is like such a depressive and kind of dark and all of that. And many times now, and it still surprises me when I kind of get to the core of the core of the core, there's just like this bubbling fountain of joy, and um, that's very genuine, and that's just super open and you know enthusiastic and things like that. Which that is like the not me. Like what who is that? But it feels wonderful because it's very liberating and
The not you, actual you.
right, exactly, yeah.
The not you, not ego you, deeper you.
Yeah, yeah, and so it's so amazing to, like, be this, like, dark, miserable, suffering for, that and to start seeing, wow, that really is just the veils, and when the veils
Yes.
completely come off, I'm like a bundle of joy, like, "What?" No one's ever
Yeah.
gonna do that. So,
Yes.
yeah, that's surprising because the things like, the creativity and the connection and the love and the bounty and the connection to nature, that's not a big surprise. But this like bubbling fountain of joy always like, and
Mhm.
feeling the
Mhm.
truth of it in my core is
Mhm.
something else. So
So beautiful.
I hope my other four social four brothers and sisters out there have that experience too, because yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure, and you describe it so well. And I like also the cautionary note that you added in there of like, don't just tell us to look on the bright side, don't just say, well, can you look at the positive now that you've looked at the darker side? It's like, it doesn't really work like that. It's like you said, it's more of engagement with what's true and allowing yourself. It sounded like you really did a great job of like allowing yourself to kind of relax and let go of some of what your ego was whispering in your ear and just be with who you really are. And I think because of your long-term practice as a seeker and a practitioner in different things, you are able to really drop down and be in that deeper place. And I love that what's in that deeper place is a lot of joy. And it
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense to me knowing you as I do. And I think it reminds me and all of us that, often joy and pain or joy and suffering are two sides of the same coin. And some of us just get in the habit of looking more on one side than the other and forgetting the other side is there. But as we sometimes teach, all of us are kind of the opposite of our ego or our personality when we're in essence, when we're really more realized as who we actually are. So I love the way you describe all that with so much clarity.
Yeah, and what I can add to that too is that from that place of being just open in essence and joyful, there's just a natural kind of radiance that is helpful and uplifting and soothing and things to others that's effortless. I mean, I apply effort because, I have to use my mind and things like that. But when I'm not connected, and this is historically, I had to have will still offer those kinds of um, empathy and feeling and tuning in and that kind of thing to others, and consequently, have become very depleted, right, over time.
Mm,
And so,
mhm,
so much of my practice right now is just kind of coming back, not overextending and being available to others, but having to really plug in, be available to myself so that then I can just naturally radiate these qualities that then are of benefit. But
mhm. Without
yeah,
it costing you so much to work to express yourself. Is that how it
yeah,
feels?
yeah, yeah. And so for all the social dominance out there, of really, it's just not second nature to take care of my own needs. I
Right,
mean, kind
right.
of, right? I mean, my
Yeah,
needs were being approved of. Those are the needs I'm taking care of my own.
right,
But
right.
it looks like I'm, kind of over giving energy that I don't have anymore. And
And do you think some of the energy that sense of depletion that I know you've had lately, do you think some of that energy comes from the not only the giving of yourself to others, but the energy that goes into like what you described as sort of the worrying about how you'll be received or, if it will be enough or that kind of thing. Is that part of the depletion of how the ego can get involved and question you or, make you feel like it's not enough so that it's not just as simple, like you said, being there and radiating what
yeah.
you have to offer energetically. It's more of this challenge, the fight, the inner fight that happens when you interact with the outside world.
Yeah, it's very interesting you're saying that because it's kind of two levels. So one is, it is always there, and now that you're bringing it to my attention, it's like, oh yeah, that is a source of depletion that's ever present. And then there's this layer of like, okay, so I will mollify this negativity about myself by doing something good and offering myself to other, which I love and is fulfilling. But then, oh, but I don't have the energy to do that. So I need to
Mhm.
exert myself to set a boundary or not be available. And then I further drain myself by angsting over it for a very long time. So it's like, yeah,
Right.
it's not pretty bee. It's
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But again, I think there's a lesson in there for all of us of how we spend a lot of energy kind of in our ego game, in the fight with the ego, the jihad, the original meaning of the word jihad is the inner fight, between the ego and the higher self. And it's almost like I can hear how depleting that must be. Like you say, being a social, being concerned about making a contribution, and at the same time, how you're perceived. Like you talked about, there's always this fear of abandonment, rejection, judgment. And then you're also judging yourself as not ideal or not good enough, and what's happening. And so it's almost like, it's a I think sometimes, to some extent, social fours seem to me to be just more aware of that kind of inner struggle that all of us have in a different format. It's like, maybe for me it's not the main event, but it's in there.
Yeah.
There is also a part of me that's worried about what people think. I mean, heart types, I think probably we all have this to some degree in different ways. But then everyone who has any kind of, issue with putting themselves out there or interacting with others or trying to be a part of a group or a community, there's so much work that our ego imposes on us, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I think as a social four, it's like you're finally attuned to that inner experience, and the attention is a little bit more focused on the being stuck in some of the negative parts of it. And even while you can also do a lot to bring yourself out and know that's not really who you are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in terms like the melancholy or the gap or the fixation there, there's this thing that happens where I have an idea, an inspiration to do something, and so, or even I had this happen the other day where a friend was out of town, and I was in San Francisco, and she was coming in, and I thought, oh, I'm going to go pick her up at the airport. That'd be nice. And I had the thought, and then I haven't been feeling well, so I was like, just to myself, you can't go pick her up at the airport. What are you, crazy? It's like, and she didn't know anything about it. She would never have expected it. But then I started being like mad at myself for like, ugh, now you're not going to go pick her up. And it's this thing of like seeing the possibility, or when I think, oh, I want to do this for someone's birthday and I'll make this card. And then it's like, I'm too tired and I can't. So I'll just have to buy something. I'll write, I can't. And this discrepancy between my idea and then all I see is how it's falling short. And I didn't do it to the level at which I had hoped. And then I have a really hard time with it. And then I feel bad. And then I feel bad about myself. And it's very hard to be me.
I'm getting that message.
Social four.
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking it sounds a little bit like a one that doesn't, that outcome doesn't match their ideal sense of what might be perfect,
Yeah.
only with much more emotions and
Yeah.
a much stronger feeling about the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of self denigration, I mean, now I know better. I won't let myself go down that, but it's still,
Yeah,
I have to watch it. And yeah.
right, right. And again, I think it serves a defensive purpose in that it's familiar, and that, at least for me, like the way I've touched into four, it can feel like, well, if I've already sort of decided, or if I've already um, seen like what was lacking, I'm not going to be surprised if someone else sees what's lacking in me. Like if
Yeah.
I get there first and I already have felt all these feelings and see it this way, then you can't kind of surprise me by judging me more than I'm judging myself. There can sometimes be what to others can be a surprising benefit or secondary gain by having this sense of, well, I've already hit bottom myself, so you're not going to take me under. I'm not going to be surprised by a failure that I have or some kind of rejection, because I've already decided how I'm going to be rejected first.
That's right. 100%. It's like, yeah, I don't want to risk the humiliation. And so I won't, yeah, I won't.
Right. And
Yeah.
it also, I think, points to the comparing mind of the four, of like you've said, you compare yourself not only to others, but also to an ideal that you created of what you wanted to do. But then for some reason or other, you couldn't do it the way you had envisioned. And so now there's a sort of a deficient present that is compared to this idealistic future that you had in mind.
Yeah.
And so that can be something. And again, I think um, something I'm getting that applies to all the types and subtypes is how much energy we can spend on the ego activity that
Yeah.
this represents, and the fact that it can leave us depleted, all of us, I think, in different ways. So I want to ask you, if somebody is in relationship with a social four, what tips do you have for them? Like,
Good
what
luck.
might you want people to understand about social fours so we
Oh,
can relate to them better?
yeah. Okay, well, I think maybe I should just speak for myself, but uh, I think I can also speak for my brothers and sisters here. Just a major high degree of sensitivity, and so um, we have this very finely tuned radar that senses people's going away. And then because of the deficiency mind, we'll fill in the blanks with, oh, they must be mad at me or something happened or they're leaving me. And so then we can kind of start getting internal about that and moody and it's like, I mean, for me, my system is very sensitive and the data points coming in are multiple all the times on many levels, and I'm an empath like most social fours are, and so
Mm.
not only am I feeling my stuff, but I'm also feeling everyone else's, much of which is unfelt by them. And so there's just
Right.
a lot going on, and so I think um and we tend to reject ourselves, so the kindness and care and loving, reassurance and being reflected back with our goodness and what people appreciate about us. And um, yeah, and that also the sadness isn't a horror, for me anyway. I wouldn't want someone to talk me out of my sadness. It's just, I'm just having it. It's okay, so for other people to not be so afraid of
Mm.
our feelings, you know?
Right, right, right. Yeah, like you're not afraid of sadness. In fact, it can be a rich experience
Right,
of what's happening now.
right,
Yeah.
right, and then I think there's a really tricky area where we have a tendency to, um, be unaware that we are feeling like a victim, you know?
Uh,
And
yeah,
so, yeah, like, we take on the victim thing, but we're not aware of it. We really think something bad is happening or something bad has happened to us, and so that can be really tricky for people to intervene with because they're saying like, "Hello, you're not a victim." But
right.
if you go in there, then we can feel more victimized, right? And it's a low level. It's
This is starting to sound very tricky.
yeah, right? So it's really tricky. So I think it's just more like, "Hey, what's going on? Hey, how you feeling? And, is there anything that you need from me?" So that kind of thing, you know?
Right,
Yeah,
right, right. That's great. It makes a lot of sense. And like you're saying, being aware of how sensitive you are, and it's not about like getting you out of sadness or telling you to look on the bright side at all. It's like understanding you. What is your experience? Being interested and also pointing out what we love about you.
yeah.
Like if I was to say to you right now, you can tell me if it's bad or good to hear this, but of how you're one of the smartest people I know, one of the best therapists. You have a great sense of humor. You're someone that, people can really go to and talk about a challenge with, and you always have something amazing to say that's really, really helpful.
Yeah, no, I mean, I love hearing that, and it doesn't hit me in like a ego place. It
Yeah.
hits me really in the core of my heart and just being seen, you know? So I
Yeah.
really appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Lizzie. I think this has been a really enlightening episode for people to really understand the inner experience of a social four. So, thank you for your honesty and your authenticity, and for doing this and being so revealing. I think it is gonna help a lot of people.
Yeah, I hope so. It's funny because 'cause I'll watch and I'll go, "Oh," like, "I should have said this and I should have said this," because, but everything is just this kind of fluid, and we did this right here in this point in time, and I'm really happy to see you actually also. Like,
Exactly. Exactly. It's always good to talk to you and be with you. And it was, I think, just coming together and talking about what what was important to talk about in the moment. So thank you so much.
You are welcome. Thanks, Bea.
So that does it for this episode of the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. We hope you will join us next time, where Uranio Pius will be back with me, and where we'll talk about all things Enneagram.